Now, Bharat Anand, author of The Content Trap and professor at the Harvard Business School, has studied in detail the strategic challenges facing digital businesses. So much so that his intense understanding of content across platforms has won him the title of being one of the foremost thinkers and strategists of his time. We're lucky that the professor is right here with us at the Brand Equity Studio today, and I'm all set to pick his brains on everything content, digital, and of course, tackling that very elusive consumer. Thanks for joining us, Professor. Truly a pleasure having you on Brand Equity.
Nice to be here, Sonali. Thank you.
You are an expert in how companies are transforming themselves into digital businesses. Do you think they've done a good job?
So I think there's probably 3 or 4 phases of what we might refer to as digital transformation that companies go through.
Okay.
Phase 1 is, if you will, looking at digital technologies or the internet just as a distribution channel, right? You put up a website, you can sell products through it, you transact.
Sure.
It turns out that most companies are still in phase 1.
Okay.
Phase 2, you might think of as gathering data,
Okay.
but then more importantly, also taking advantage of interactivity, meaning we can hear from the consumer. It actually becomes an interactive medium as opposed to simply a one-way flow of goods and services. Phase 3 is when companies start taking advantage of what I call connectedness. I mean, in some sense, that's really the advantage of digital technologies. People can connect to each other,
Sure.
not just to companies. And that requires almost a redefinition, thinking of yourself not as a vehicle for selling products, but as a platform for people, consumers, buyers, and sellers to connect. So think Facebook, think Uber, think Airbnb. That's what we might call phase 3 companies. It turns out for traditional companies, making that transition is very hard.
Sure.
By the way, we might think of phase 4 as really cultural transformation, when digital is simply a part of everything else,
Sure.
as opposed to something separate.
Sure. Would you say that the journey that we have taken in this whole digital transition, would you say companies today understand their consumers better?
I think it's very hard to generalize, Sonali. So in some sense, I mean, think about setting up a Facebook page. You can get feedback from your customers,
Yeah.
and that's fantastic feedback on the kinds of things you do.
Sure.
That doesn't necessarily mean that, all companies are in that position where they're listening carefully.
Okay.
Right? So it really varies a lot. I mean, I would say that if you think about the question, just starting with media companies, do we understand our consumers better?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure, right? In some sense, I don't think we understand the old questions of segmentation and, customer demographics and so on still hold. Data itself doesn't tell you about customer behavior or intent. At the time you're making a decision to buy a product, your intent actually matters. The demographics might be less so.
Sure.
So context matters, intent matters. Those are the same old questions in marketing.
Exactly. One would assume that because we're all connected and we're in touch with so many more people than we were, let's say, 10 years ago, my understanding as a human being of the world at large and what people are thinking, which may be views which are very different from mine, culturally different, ideologically different, but I would still have a view broadly of the world at large I'm living in. But the paradox is the world that I live in seems to have become much smaller with the digital world than it was, let's say, 10 years ago. I'm saying this much smaller in a negative manner because I think the whole development and the whole understanding of what an echo chamber is, because I'm basically, since social media at large is only trying to please me and give me what I want so that, I am just more and more addicted to their platforms. I'm technically, very removed from the reality at large, and I'm really talking about Brexit, which is a big shocker, and of course, the U.S. presidential elections. Both these events just stated that if data was that advanced, and we're talking about data mining and analytics all the time for the last 2 years, what happened? And B, if everybody on my timeline seemed to have opinion A, then how did opinion B become the truth? And why was it such a shock for me and many others? Is it because I'm so removed from the real world?
So I think there's 2 parts to connectedness. The first is, as companies, do we understand our consumers better? The second part is, as individuals, do we understand each other better? Right? So if you think about these events that just happened, they probably were a result or an expression of at least 3 kinds of forces that played out in the media. The first is this idea that everyone's a media company, meaning we don't have to run political campaigns through traditional media alone, right? Everyone can tweet, everyone can reach millions of people. In fact, all the traditional metrics like television advertising, foot soldiers, get out the vote operations are probably less meaningful today. But the second is that traditional and digital media are still complementary, meaning for social media to be effective, it's got to be amplified by traditional media. So if we think about, what happened again, at least in the US election, the difference in earned media coverage, as it's called, right, between, let's say, President Trump versus Bernie Sanders was very, very large. And that, I think, has to do with the incentives of traditional media to cover news, surprises, sensational events. The third part really gets at what you're saying, which is, at the end of the day, it partly also depends on you and me as consumers. So one of the advantages of digital media is that we can connect with anyone. One of the unintended consequences is when we connect, we seek out people like us. We look for things which are similar. By the way, this is reinforced by targeting strategies and personalization strategies of social networks and so on, which results in echo chambers, filter bubbles, and so on. Now, breaking that aspect turns out to be the most insidious, right? Because we can think about incentives of media firms and so on to address one of the first two issues, but how do you actually address the demand side issue? That turns out to be a much harder problem.
Okay. I want to talk to you about, something that you're very, very familiar with and mastered really is, which is content across platforms.
Mm-hmm.
What we find in India, and actually several parts of the world, is that the concept of content has been cut, copy, pasted from what we know works in traditional media and has been plastered on social media. Don't you think it's becoming, content is becoming a very, very highly abused word, and B, the kind of content that is being dished out for, which is termed as engaging content and so many million likes and hits and shares, is really marketers trying to tell their CEOs that we've done a good job?
This idea of what we might call digital first, meaning let's take a piece of content and actually think about what's the right expression of that in a digital format, is something that very few companies still do. Now, take the example of newspapers, right? In the early days, what do? They just put the PDFs of the news stories online. It turns out today it may not be the PDF, but it's almost the same article, which is not that different.
Yeah.
You're not really taking advantage of the medium. When we think about video streaming called over the top, oftentimes we're simply taking the 60-minute show and just streaming it through broadband.
Yep.
That's not digital first, right? So you see this time and time again. In some sense, we're seeing now over the last years, and in fact, over the last decade, some companies which have tried to do this with great success. I'll give you one example. There's a company in Scandinavia. It's called Schibsted. It's a media company. It's one of the leading media companies there. One of the things that they do when they actually put news on their website is the first thing you see is it's mostly pictures. Okay? Now, there's very little text. Now, why was that the case? I mean, if you go to the NewYorkTimes.com or the WashingtonPost.com or most news sites, you'll see a lot of text. Now, why is that? Oh, it turns out one of the first people they hired was a photographer.
Oh, okay.
And he said, this is fantastic. I can put pictures up. Now, why is it that most traditional media companies don't like to put pictures? Because there's this perception that somehow it cheapens the brand, right? When we put pictures in a newspaper, it was usually the last thing we did, not the first.
Yeah.
And it suddenly reeked of being tabloid. So they put a lot of pictures, bold headlines, and then what you see is a very long front page. It just scrolls and scrolls and scrolls. Now, that was also almost by default. They didn't have an IT team. When they had to put stories, they said, let's put it on the top and just push the rest to the bottom. It became this very long front page. But think about this for a second, right? Why is it that most pages, front pages of news websites, look almost identical to the print paper, right? It's a mystery.
Yeah.
There's no reason it should be because you have more shelf space.
Yeah.
So then they see this happening, and a few months later, the editor-in-chief walked in and he said, what's going on? Like, why is this page so long? So then they hired some IT folks, they shortened the page, and they found that traffic dropped.
Wow.
And then they ran some experiments, and they found that, people like to click through, but they like even more to browse. That's digital first. Now you take that, right, where you're actually thinking about changing content to the format. It turns out most of the time we're pretty lazy. We just take the traditional format, content, and put it online. This is what I meant by phase one, that the internet is just a distribution channel.
Yeah.
When we start thinking about different formats, interactivity, connectedness, that's when it becomes powerful. I'll give you another example in their context. I don't know if you remember the volcanic ash crisis over Iceland,
Right.
which
Right.
spread over Europe several years ago. So, all air travel was disrupted. Things were chaotic in most European countries. What was the most popular piece of content that Shipset put out on its websites? It wasn't about the health implications of the volcano. It wasn't about weather patterns when this thing would pass through. Those were the natural stories you'd expect. No. What they see is that people are sending messages through their website simply saying, look, how do I get from Oslo to Trondheim? I'm stuck. Someone else responding saying, oh, I'm leaving at 3 o'clock. I can pick up 3 people at the train station in my car. They create an app within 7 hours called the Hitchhiker Central simply to allow people to connect.
Wow.
It led to a question that they asked themselves, how do we help readers help each other? Not how do we produce the best content. That became the defining question that they asked. By the way, this is one of the things that are referred to in the content trap. A lot of companies think that the route to success in digital worlds is make the best content. It turns out when you have connected markets digitally, the best content need not win. I mean, just think about this for a second. Over the last decade, roughly $3 trillion of market value created by 10 digital giants. Facebook, Google, Amazon, and so on. They are not in the content business. By the way, all of them increasingly playing in the content business because it helps their core business. But that's part of the challenge. What you're describing of media companies applies everywhere else, by the way. I mean, we see this in education. When you look at, 5 years ago, there was a lot of excitement around using online as a way to disseminate education, high-quality courses to people in the world for free, right? Just think about that. I mean, democratizing education is fantastic. Having said that, the mode was simply let's capture the video of the classroom lecture, put it online. Oh, it turns out if you thought the classroom lecture was boring, looking at that online is even more boring.
That's so true.
Right? Watching the 60-minute video, I mean, there's nothing could be worse. So engagement rates drop dramatically, and completion rates are of the order of 1%.
Mm-hmm.
That's the tension I talk about between reach and engagement. It's not simply a question of reaching more people. You've got to actually think about what the digital medium offers you in terms of content, and then try and adapt.
Give me an example of, let's say, one company, or if you can think of a couple, that would be great, which you think have understood, you gave me one example, but have actually understood the way to market themselves to their end consumer. Somebody does it right. Somebody who's not just making content for the sake of it because it's in vogue today. And then I'll come with my rejoinder.
So there's a few companies around the world. I mean, we can think of media companies. We can think of companies now in education as well, which are trying the same thing. But part of the challenge, again, I think there's 3 challenges here. One is don't get intoxicated by data. Right? Because data might tell you a lot about superficial characteristics of customers. It doesn't really tell you a lot about meaningful engagement with the customer.
Okay.
The second is, trying to optimize on reach, but also being very careful about customer engagement. The third aspect, which I think is fundamental, has to do with this idea of connectedness. Let me sort of give an example. In connected markets, you often see a dynamic where we have winner take all. Right? Once you're ahead, you have more customers. The value to additional customers from coming on a platform increases. So think about Facebook. As there's more friends, what are the chances that you will go on that platform versus something else? Oh, it's much higher. So they end up winning the entire market. In winner-take-all markets, guess how much you need to spend on marketing? When was the last time you saw an ad for Facebook, not on Facebook? You don't see ads for Facebook.
In fact, not even Apple.
Right? Never. Now, part of the reason for that is that when you win the install base, when you win in winner-take-all markets, your customers essentially become your sales force. That's an idea that some companies are picking on to, right? Which is, how do we actually get customers to spread the word? And it's not simply, word of mouth and virality. It's actually my value from the product increases as there are more other customers. I'll give you one example. These are events that we often see. 2 years ago during the Super Bowl is traditionally one of the moments in the year when you see a lot of television advertising. It also turns out to be a headache for most companies, right? Because you're spending a lot of money and you don't know what the return is. 2 years ago, one of the most popular ads was, and in fact probably the second most watched ad during that event, was by JCPenney, where they spent $0 on advertising. What did they do? They just had a series of tweets. And it went something like the following. 10 minutes into the game, they tweet, Seattle scoring a touchdown against Denver. There were all spelling mistakes in the tweet. So what happens, people pick up on this and say, hold on a second, what's going on with JCPenney's tweets? 10 minutes later, some more spelling mistakes. Suddenly, everyone's picking up saying, is there an intern who's drunk, who's managing their Twitter handle? The competitors start tweeting them. This goes viral. After half an hour, they then come back with a tweet saying, oops, sorry, tweeting with mittens. And they had a photo of mittens. Now, they were making the mittens for the U.S. Winter Olympic team. They were the official sponsor. This thing goes completely viral. It's not a question of something that's unpredictable. This was entirely planned. Right? Now, that's an example where you're saying, what is it I can do that actually ends up incentivizing people to share? You've got to think hard about those behaviors.
Sure.
And so we see episodes like this. I think companies are beginning to understand this, but it's hard.
But don't you think that a lot of companies need not technically have a Facebook account?
Oh, not at all.
Need not have a Twitter handle.
Yeah.
Because, and need not have a mini content company.
Absolutely.
Or content wing, within their organization.
As I said, everyone's a media company today, right? So one of the advantages of that is that we don't need to rely on traditional platforms, whether Facebook or traditional media companies, to get the word out. If I'm a company, I can directly transact with customers through my website. Now, that has advantages, but, there's also clutter. So you've also got to be where people are, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or so on. That doesn't become a substitute for actually getting marketing right, right? We often think, oh, digital, this is a panacea. We just put out some social media tweets and we're home free. No, it couldn't be further from the truth. Because in some sense, there's much more clutter in digital.
Yeah.
So you've got to be that much more creative about thinking about your campaign and what your customers really want.
So would you at some level also advise marketers saying that, if you want to go digital and you want to reach out to your consumers in the digital world, you've got to be a lot more sharper, edgier, and really ahead of the game. So if you're not there, don't just follow, the herd and just put out your content there. Abstain from the medium completely. Would you give them that advice?
Yeah. So in fact, one of the parts of what I call the content trap is this tendency that companies have to look around, let's see what's working, let's see what others are doing,
Sure.
and then embrace what they're doing and mimic it. Right? We often think of those as best practices. What are the best practices in social media marketing or digital media? By the way, this applies equally well to thinking about product characteristics or anything else. That's what I refer to as the third leg of the content trap, which is beware. Because in some sense, if you think about what strategy is about competitive advantage. It's about being different. The last thing you want to do is just mimic everyone else.
Yep.
And oftentimes, the reason it works for another company may be because of their particular context, their customers, their DNA, their history. There may be very good reasons why the same thing may not work for you, right? Think about what we just saw in the newspaper industry in the US. The New York Times launched a paywall about 3 years ago, and this was a very particular way of pricing online subscriptions.
Okay.
It worked. 100 other newspapers followed suit immediately, thinking, oh, this is going to solve all our problems. Most of them failed. Why? The reason the paywall works for the New York Times has a lot to do with the New York Times.
Yes.
So in some sense, this idea of being different actually gets amplified in digital worlds. Because the moment you start mimicking each other, it just reinforces the clutter.
So just before I let you go, I want to ask you, a question which I seek your opinion on, because it's something that I've asked a lot of people and different views. Do you think in a digital world, and when you're approaching content, you're approaching marketing, the world has moved, everybody is online, okay, fair enough, but the people who are designing content to be pushed into this medium for the end consumer are not digital people. So, for instance, the chief marketing officer of any organization today is not a digital native.
Yep.
He's struggling.
Yep.
Of course, he has accounts everywhere. Everybody has an account, but they're still grappling with the change because it's not easy. It's not easy to me. It's just easy for somebody who's 45, 50 to start tweeting out, to start be active on Snapchat, be active on Insta. They're just grappling with what is this ridiculous app. That's their first thought, and they're hoping that their kids will educate them. But do you think our fundamental flaw is the fact that the structures are not open enough to get in younger people who may have a better perspective on what works and what doesn't work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So almost any company that I know of struggles with this question. And this has to do with what I was describing as cultural change in the organization. How do you, in fact, both straddle the old world, where, in fact, your core business might be doing okay, but also make the ship ready for the digital world? There's a phrase, in fact, that I heard when I was at Shipstead, which turned out to stick with me. It's a phrase they use to try and navigate this tension. They call it forget and borrow. And the idea is there's a lot of habits that we have that come from just simply the way we do things, which we take for granted.
Yeah.
And we think the reason we had success here in the traditional world, well, those are precisely the same rules that would apply here in the digital world. Those often turn out to be wrong. And so organizations need to forget those habits. At the same time, there's certain assets we need to borrow, whether it's brand, whether it's some content expertise, whether it's cash. How do you actually navigate that tension? That's probably one of the hardest things that companies struggle with. Now, companies do this in different ways. I mean, one of the things, coming back to this idea of not mimicking, Shipstead, they hire a lot of young people to run their digital businesses. They separate out digital from print. They run it almost entirely separate with a dotted line to corporate. Having said that, take another example like The Economist, right? And describe this at length in the book. The Economist is a magazine we all know and respect. They were very slow to go online. By the way, in fact, they were so slow, they didn't even register the domain name in time.
Okay.
So if you went to theeconomist.com, you'd see a photo of Alan Greenspan for 15 years. They never staffed it with entirely new people. It was always the print insiders who were leading digital. They integrated print and digital. They charged for digital content, and guess what? This is one of the most successful magazines in the last 15 years. Why is that? Oh, because at the core of it is a fundamental value proposition that's very different for The Economist than for Shipstead.
Sure.
Shipstead's all about breaking news.
Yeah.
If your proposition is breaking news, you better be fast and aggressive and free. If your proposition, like The Economist, is no, I'm trying to give you a perspective on the world. I'm trying to help you escape from breaking news.
Yeah.
That leads you down a very different direction.
Got it.
And so when you think about this tension of forget and borrow, where you end up on that spectrum, often the answer to that is very different for different media companies or different companies in general.
Thank you so much, Professor. This was truly insightful. A lot of very, very interesting ideas and concepts coming from you. And I hope marketers watching this show will take your thoughts seriously.
Thank you, Sonali.